trying to formulate and stick to a plan that involves quite large life changes, maybe to do with career and finances, relationships, your physique, perhaps you are trying to change the way you look through diet and exercise. All of these things that involve really concentrated effort over a period of time can be so hard when there's always something new being thrown in your face, a new hack, a new challenge. We're not doing the 3-month year, instead we're doing 75 hard. Or perhaps it's a new potential opportunity, or your mood is changing. Trying to stick to the plan when there are all these things going on, but also knowing when you should probably be pivoting and trying something new is one of the hardest things I think about executing a plan over a long term. And it's something that I've struggled with, and I know that a lot of people have struggled with in terms of trying to achieve their goals, which is why I want to introduce something called the single source of truth, because I think it's going to change the way that you think about plans, planning and executing and pivoting at the right time. Now, I came across the concept of the single source of truth actually through tech and engineering, and it's changed the way that I approach planning and pivoting, right? More of a systematic approach to it when it comes to things like building my YouTube to over 100,000, but also progressing in my career and making changes and knowing when to double down and stay on the path and knowing when actually it's time to veer off of it. But also things like building my physique in terms of being somebody who powerlifts over the years, but knowing, it's time to do more of this, less of this, or actually we're doing the right thing. So I don't want to waste too much time. Let's get into what the single source of truth is and how to actually practically use it in order to get closer to achieving your goals and executing how you want. So what is the single source of truth? I'm actually going to use an example to illustrate this. Think about your favorite app, whether it's Google, YouTube, Instagram, Notion, doesn't really matter. What matters is that application that you see is informed by code, right? There is a blueprint for how that thing should execute, how it should look, how it should function. Now that code that informs how you experience that end product has to exist somewhere. If we want to evolve and make changes to it, we have to know how to do that, the processes that are in place. Right? But we also have to protect it. We can't just let anybody start tampering with it. And this forms the basis of the single source of truth. That authoritative version that is impacting what production looks like is known as the single source of truth. We have all accepted it as part of this organization, and in a sense of what we're going to talk about, you as an individual, that this is the blueprint that we are going by. This is the accepted version of production. Now imagine we just tampered with the single source of truth on a whim. My mood's changed. I don't really feel like the single source of truth should look like this anymore. I'm going to make a change here. Or, there's a new shiny object over there. Let's add that to the single source of truth. You can start to see how chaos could ensue, because at any point, at any moment, with any change that's going on in the external environment, somebody could just decide to tamper with and change the single source of truth without any checks, any balances, no process in place. Now, we could not only end up temporarily breaking the end product, but we might actually veer so far off from our objectives, from what we were trying to achieve, that it no longer reflects what we're going for. It no longer reflects the aims of the organization or us as individuals. Now, hopefully you can start to see the kind of parallels between the blueprint or the code that is informing production, but also the plan that is informing our version of production, our life, and how we want to execute and what we want to see. Now, imagine these two approaches to your plan, your blueprint for your life and what you're trying to achieve. On one hand, you have no checks, nothing in place. Something pops up on TikTok. There's a new way that we're approaching things. There's a new challenge. There's a new AI tool, because there's one that comes out probably every 30 seconds, every 30 minutes, 30, right? You could do that and you could see what happens, but don't be surprised if you're never actually achieving anything that you intend to because of the chaos of that method. Or we could have a series of checks and balances in place for our single source of truth that could allow us, like I said, to pivot and to execute in an actually productive way. And that's what we're going to get into, the practical implementations of the single source of truth. So the first thing that we need to talk about before we kind of dive deeper into how we might interact with a single source of truth, pivot, stay on track, is actually formulating the foundations of it. And one of the most important things to focus on is how that blueprint actually relates to what's going to be seen in production. Now, this seems like a really obvious point, right? Like, does the goals, does the things that you have written in the blueprint, in the code, actually lead to the outcomes that you want? But the problem is that we can start to add all of these things to our list, to our blueprint, that aren't actually going to move the needle forward. They're not actually going to lead to us seeing what we want from our end product, from our life, from our execution. And this is where it's really important to get specific about the objectives that you have. Think about it like this. We have things that we want to achieve, the blueprint and execution, right? Perhaps on this list of things that I want to achieve is I want to be fitter. What does that mean? What on earth does that mean? How am I going to write a code for I want to be fitter? You see how this very broad, overarching, sweeping statement isn't going to be very useful in writing a piece of code that is going to lead to the end product that I want, right? That it's just too broad. However, if I said, right, when I was formulating my single source of truth, if it related to the fact that I want to build more muscle, well, suddenly the code or the blueprint becomes a lot more clearer to write, because it means that I need to do more weight training, more resistance training. I need to increase my protein intake. I need to work out how much I should probably be intaking in terms of my macros based on my size, based on how often I will be training, right? The code can be more clearly linked to that goal, and production is more likely to look like what you want it to, right? Your life and how you are executing is going to be more in line with what it is that you're trying to achieve. And this is a really important part and step to building our single source of truth. And it's something that we have to think about in tech when we're writing code. What are we trying to achieve? Imagine the goal or the thing that I was trying to do is just have a light background on the website. Light what? What code do I write for that? Light pink? Cream? There should be a button. A button where? What does the button do? Right? You see how these broad sweeping statements don't allow us to write effective code in order to see what we want from production. Right? The single source of truth almost becomes not useless, but not as useful as it can be if it is not informed by clear objectives and goals. Now, another reason this is very important is because what can happen is we can end up lifting and shifting other people's goals into our own lives, right? Because we're not quite clear on what it is that we're trying to achieve. We just kind of take their blueprint verbatim, right? We just take it and copy and paste them. And then our life looks a certain way and we're like, that's not quite what I was going for. Well, that's probably because you're using somebody else's blueprint and you haven't taken the time to formulate a single source of truth that relates to what it is you are trying to achieve. Now, this seems so obvious, but this is one of the steps where everybody goes wrong, from big business to individuals, is understanding what the goals we're trying to achieve actually are, what the objectives look like, so that we can write the code and execute. Right? That bit there is sometimes the hardest part. What are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to be more muscular? Are you trying to have a six-figure salary and a six-figure? Are you trying to build a business? Or are you trying to do something else where life may look like somebody who has a business, but actually that's not what you're after. You're after the freedom that that person has, but it may not involve the code being build a business. It may be you getting a remote tech job, right? That is making you X amount a year, but allows you to travel and do these other things. So let's move on a little bit from that, because I did speak about moving and pivoting as one of the most challenging parts. And I want to make it clear that having a plan does not mean rigidity. Consistency and being rigid are not the same thing. Now, in order to see long-term success, we know that we have to be consistent over a period of time, right? We need to execute the plan, the blueprint consistently over a period of time. That doesn't mean, though, that we can never make changes, that we can never pivot, that we can never introduce new things. And I think changing the way that you think about plans and thinking of them as more flexible and fluid will stop you panicking about them so much, right? And even fearing putting a plan in place, because sometimes I feel that we don't even want to put a plan or a single source of truth in place because we're just so worried about being locked in a way that may not be beneficial long term. So let's talk a little bit about then, how do you interact with the single source of truth and make changes in a way that is not chaotic and it's still going to be fruitful? Now, this is where I'm going to introduce a method called branching. Now, again, we're going to get a little bit technical here, but bear with me. The single source of truth is what we can consider the main branch, right? Or the trunk of the tree, right? Here, everything has been agreed on. The code has been agreed on. Anything that's been changed has gone through a process, right? However, we may want to explore something new. We may want to try developing something new with the code. And at this point, we may start to branch off. We have not tampered with the single source of truth. We are not stating that, well, I saw this one thing on TikTok about 75 hard, so forget the 90-day challenge I was on, or forget the long-term plan I had over the next 6 months. But we're going to think about how this particular thing that has just popped up, or opportunity, may be beneficial, and if we even want to bring it into the single source of truth and make adjustments. This is kind of your experimentation phase, where you dedicate a period of time to exploring, to branching off. Now, let me use another example to illustrate this, right? Imagine you want to move into tech, and you have made a plan. Your single source of truth involves you being a self-taught developer. Say you're going to be a software developer, right? And you're putting some things in place to be a software developer. You've gathered your materials and so forth. You've been working on this for quite a while. Now, imagine an opportunity comes up to join a boot camp. Maybe it was a free boot camp, or at a discount of like 50%, 75%. You have two options here. You can completely ignore it because your single source of truth or your plan says, we're going to do it this way. The blueprint says this. Or we can formulate a branch. We have all the information, we have all of the blueprint that we have established with our single source of truth to build a foundation upon, but we're going to build a branch and we're going to explore this opportunity here. Now that might mean taking several hours out of a day or a week or a month to understand what this opportunity is and how it's going to impact your production, how it's going to impact where you are trying to get to and the journey that you are on, linking back to those goals. Because it may be the case that you explore this branch and work out, actually, this is a way for me to get to my end goal quicker, more efficiently, with more resources, with more help, right? Because I know what I'm trying to achieve, which is software developer in X category or in X industry. Well, this is the way for me to get there. It's an alternative way, and this is what I'm going to go forward with. Or you may decide that actually, I'm scrapping this. I've explored it. I've reached a point where I don't think this is right for me at the moment, but it was good that I explored the branch. Now that's great. We've established that we can branch off and put time into developing and exploring things that link back to our goals, even if they weren't part of the original plan. But then what kind of process do we have for pulling this back into the single source of truth if we want to, that branch forming back into the tree, or scrapping it? We need a process, right? You need something in place that isn't based on emotions, moods, fleeting things, pop-ups on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube. You need something that is more structured. And this is where you have to formulate an actual process that allows you to move and pivot with your single source of truth. Now let's circle back to that example of transitioning into tech, right? That we had our plan that was going to be self-taught. Now we've got a boot camp potentially. What is actually the steps that we're going to take to make that decision? Everyone will have a process that makes sense to themselves, but the important thing is that you've agreed on it and that you know that it works in terms of actually making informed decisions. For some people, it may involve a set amount of time journaling as a starting point to get your thoughts out of your head. It may involve opening up a page in Notion or in whatever documents you use to outline the pros and cons. It may involve spending X amount of time on official websites, checking for what this actual opportunity or this challenge or whatever it is involves and what are the outcomes, what are the stakes involved. It may involve a peer review process, right? So in tech, when they have code written, we have somebody who has knowledge and who is in a position to look at this and say, that the quality of that isn't good, or this needs to be changed. Or you may have somebody who is where you want to be that you can confide in or that you can talk to and reach out to get them to review what it is that you're looking at before you put it into the single source of truth, right? These steps here stop you from just making changes on a whim that may be detrimental to what it is you are trying to achieve with production. Now, the peer review process can be quite challenging because we don't always have access to the people that we want, especially if we are looking to achieve quite big things. So there's several ways that you can then go about that, is seeking professional advice, right? Perhaps you set up a consultation with somebody to talk through your ideas and what it is. Again, somebody who has the expertise you're looking for or who is in the position you're in. But if you don't want to go down that route, it may involve tapping into resources like vlogs or free information online, where you can see other people's journeys, and perhaps it will look a lot like the thing that you are trying to do to ascertain whether this makes sense, whether going down the checks that you have for pulling back into the single source of truth, this makes sense. So work out a process that makes sense for you, for the way that your brain works, for the way that you are able to make decisions, and make sure you follow it before you introduce new things, especially big things, dramatic, impactful things to your single source of truth. Your code, your blueprint. The next thing I want to talk about with your single source of truth is actually maintenance and making sure that you are in a position to maintain the code, the blueprint that you have written. Now, this links back to, again, we can have some quite extravagant things that we are writing, right? That we are going to write out as part of our plan. Going to go gym 7 times a week. That's the code we're executing 7 times a week? Okay, can we maintain that though? Because again, this is about longevity. This is about a single source of truth that can be updated and changed and so forth, with processes, with checks, with balances that we can protect, but can we maintain it? Right, so we're talking about protection in terms of just not allowing anything into it, but now we have to talk about looking after it over the long term and making sure that, again, it's going to allow us to have a production that is consistent, that is reliable, right? And it's funny because I'm a reliability engineer, so a big part of what we have to think about is the reliability of production. It's one thing because we've got it up and running for a few hours, right? You've been to the gym session once. You read an article about moving into AI once, but you weren't able to sustain that. You weren't able to maintain that, right? You weren't able to keep it up. So now production looks very unreliable. What we are trying to see in terms of our life and executing looks very, very unreliable. So think about it. When you are making that plan, when you are making that blueprint, that is, informed by your goals. Think about maintenance at every point. Don't get swept up in these big things and, well, I want to move very fast, and so I'm going to do the most. I'm going to do absolutely everything, to the point where you're actually doing nothing. You're actually not really doing much at all, because you're falling off every time. Maintenance, maintaining your single source of truth, and the production that is informed by it is key. Now, let's talk about something that a lot of people do not like, especially us in the tech world, but it's documentation. Documentation is actually one of my personal favorite things. Do you know why? Documentation makes life so much easier. So much easier. What do I mean? Things like this process that we have put in place about what's going to happen when we want to introduce something to the single source of truth. Imagine you don't have that documented. Right, imagine you don't have that in place where you can go to, like I said, in Notion or whatever, and make sure that you've gone through the checklist, that you've documented the findings. Relying on just your mind to remember everything is it's a risky business, to be honest. And it also means that you have nothing in place to hold yourself accountable. Right, because we can convince ourselves of a lot of things, but if you've written it down, if you have the process in place, the goals, the blueprint, how we're going to update and make changes to the blueprint, if that is documented, you have a process there that you can reflect on, that you can go back to. And a key thing is that even the process is subject to change, right? As much as we could have code in place and a blueprint in place for what we're trying to achieve in production, the documentation in itself is another form of truth, right? That process that we have outlined that works for us right now, cool. We're not just going to update and make changes to it at any point again, right? Throwing things out, adding things because there's a mood change. Or I don't really feel like journaling, or I don't really feel like doing a pros and cons list. Even though that's a pivotal part of your process, you're going to go with your mood again. When I say single source of truth, that source of truth relates to something. So in terms of this, it's production. In terms of this, it's documentation, right? Document things. Have it written down. I know it doesn't sound fun all the time, or you can make it fun by doing pretty Notion templates. But the point is, have it written down somewhere and protect it. Protect it. Now, I know a lot of this may start to sound like you're taking the fun out of life, like, oh, everything's just code and blueprints and processes. But actually, it's a funny thing that happens when you have processes and checks in place, is you actually are freer to explore more things, right? Hear me out. If I know that I don't have to be fearful about interacting with a new opportunity because I have things in place, that means I know that I can try this out. I know that I can spend some time working on this new opportunity or exploring this new way of approaching, what it is I'm trying to achieve, or a new tool, because I have a process in place. So yeah, cool. Give it to me. And this is that very interesting concept that structure can actually free you up. It doesn't have to be a cage. It doesn't have to be this thing that stops you from living a free, careless life. Because on the other hand, you have no structure in place and you're always anxious. We've probably all been there. We don't know what we're doing. We have no blueprint, no code, nothing to guide us. And so we're just anxious. And so that idea of having no structure leading to a freer life isn't adding up. It isn't. So that's all I really want to talk about. I love the way that we can use principles and concepts in tech to strategize and, approach the things that we're trying to achieve in our lives. I'll see you in the next video.